Recording has started. All right, the applied behavior analysis model. There are many, many models that purport to be able to explain how it is that our behavior patterns in certain circumstances developed, why they continue on, and how to go about changing them if we see the need to do so. The ABA model is very scientific, very mathematical, based on laboratory science methods. So precision is important. And there is the collection of data, numerical information that is important to collect, eyeball, make some sense of it, and then based upon those, engage in interventions that we can gather numerical data regarding. We can continue to record on the behavior and determine whether that behavior is changing. But oh, the lingo, the talk of ABA can seem rather confusing at times, and it may not be there up there in our noggin when we're trying to retrieve it. Do know that you can find the explanations of this terminology and the concepts, of course, in our learning modules, but you can also find it on the internet with artificial intelligence, videos on YouTube and various websites. And of course, anytime this course seems overwhelming or confusing, do check in with your instructor. So if we look at data, and you see some examples here, the action, you will be identifying a target behavior, a behavior you would like to influence, change in some way in a learner, a student, a child, a youth with whom you're familiar. And in this case, the person watching, observing the individual and looking for this particular behavior, the collection of data showed that that behavior happened 14 times. And it must have been looking at how long the behavior lasts each time, because there's a total of 16 minutes and 17 seconds. You see the numbers there, the numerical information. And the person responding to it says, you know what? We can change your behavior by influencing what happens before it, the antecedent, or what follows it. Because presently, what's following the behavior is keeping it going. What comes before that behavior is what's sparking it, what's causing it to come out. So numerical information, we're measuring a behavior. Well, actually, we're measuring an aspect of it. We're measuring an attribute of that action. We're measuring what is known in ABA terminology as a dimension. And there are 6 dimensions of behavior. So in the chat right now, if any of these dimensions come to mind, please enter it into the chat. How can we change a behavior? Or what can we look at in a behavior? When that behavior happens, the target behavior that we've identified in observable, measurable, and precise terms, what can we measure regarding that behavior? And what's coming in, Dr. Turner?
We have some different stuff for frequency and duration.
Yes.
How long it is, cause, duration, frequency, duration, locus. What precipitated, so the antecedent, consequences.
All right.
So
Super. So go ahead, Dr. T.
I would just say that was intervention required, motivations. Yeah, I would I would just comment on this, that in this course, what Dr. Mack is alluding to in terms of ABC and consequences, in your schools, if you're in a school, you're going to deal with soft data and hard data. Um, the recording procedures for part one and part two are very much hard data because, and these are the dimensions that he's looking at. Though there is soft data that could be considered too. And some of that has come up in um, sort of what you're trying to do with the problem solving and thinking about it, which might come up in your part two. I just want to contextualize that if you're in a school that your school might deal with soft and hard data at the same time. This data that he's looking at in these 6 dimensions are referred to as hard data because that's what we're going to explore with that. I'll pass
Indeed.
that on to you. Yeah.
That hard data, also known as quantitative data, the numbers, but then there's other information that we'll want to collect. The grades of the student, observations of the social worker or the counselor, not numbers, but qualitative data. And as you folks entered into the chat, we have frequency, which is how often the behavior happens. 4 times per minute, 4 times per class period, 4 times per hour, 4 times per day. How often does the behavior happen for some human designated time period? We can also look at, as you mentioned in the chat, the duration. How long does the behavior last? We might put a stopwatch on it and say, oh, that episode just lasted 27 seconds. Oh, there's the behavior again. It lasted 1 minute and 12 seconds. There's a difference. You might identify, perhaps your target behavior is humming, and you'll define that in very precise words, but essentially we're looking for hmm. Now, there's a difference in acceptability in the classroom based upon duration. When a student is thinking and says, we accept that. That's considered appropriate behavior. But humming a tune, we're saying, whoa, the duration is making a difference in whether that behavior is acceptable or not. It could be how strong the behavior is, what we refer to in ABA terminology as the magnitude. That's the difference between a whisper and a yell, between a friendly punch in the shoulder and a much more aggressive, powerful, forceful punch to the shoulder. Magnitude can make a difference as to whether a behavior is okay or not okay, given the circumstances. It could be the latency, the time span between the stimulus or the antecedent and the behavior. That the bell rings, the kids get up and leave the room. Wow, there wasn't much latency, much time span between the bell and the kids leaving. And we need to remind them that the bell is the teacher's signal to determine whether it's okay to leave. An example of a longer time span that concerns us, if we give a student a direction and the student doesn't engage in that direction. Typically, we think a student would engage in a direction that we've given them within 5-10 seconds. But if it goes longer than that, we're concerned about the latency, the time span between the antecedent and the behavior. And somebody mentioned in the chat the topography, the form that the behavior takes. For example, when we say raise the hand, are we talking about bent at the elbow and hand in the air? Or are we talking about, I know, call on me? There's a difference there in the form, the topography of the behavior that makes it okay or not okay.
Just a second, Dr. Mack, if
Yep.
because there's a few questions up there. I would just like to maybe you could situate, or I'm happy to situate. Um, a few people talked about interventions. So there, in my view, when we're looking at this first stage, um, interventions might fall under antecedents or might fall under consequences. As you'll see in another slide, sometimes consequences become the antecedent. But often teachers move directly to the interventions. This is not working. This is the problem with the kid. We're in this course, we're trying to bring it back to the basics without putting any opinion on it and just collecting raw data, hard data, and then align it to these dimensions so we can problem solve. You can add all of these other issues in part two. There might have been interventions that didn't work, antecedent or consequences might have caused other things, but you can't start there with this. You have to take a step back and just go in there objectively and say, okay, what is the target behavior? And I'm going to measure that. Did you want to add anything on that, Dr. Mack?
No, that was excellent. And you were pointing out that first of all, we have to identify the behavior. We need to know when it has happened. And then we'll look at what came before it. You see in the bottom right of this slide, the antecedent. What sparked that behavior? What set it off? But after the behavior, we're going to look at what was the consequence, because we show behaviors because there's a benefit to doing so. If there wasn't a benefit, we wouldn't do it. And so we look at the consequence, and we can change a behavior by modifying what comes before it or what comes after it. But let's talk about some other terminology you're going to run across, which is, first of all, positive and negative punishment. How can there be something positive punishment? Think in mathematical terms. If something is added on, there is more of it. There is the positive effect. But if you take away something from somebody and you remove something that they want, it creates a void. It is negative punishment. We're going to get into it in just a second. That was just a quick, vague and nebulous definition. We're going to look at positive and negative reinforcement. We're all familiar with positive reinforcement. A behavior is shown and something desirable comes to that person. But negative reinforcement, we'll get into that. The important thing is to look at the final word in each of those two bullet points. Punishment, there are two types. Reinforcement, there are two types, but punishment is punishment and reinforcement is reinforcement. And we'll also look back a tad bit at antecedent.
Do you mind if I do the punishment and you do the reinforcement? Would
I
that be
would
all right?
appreciate that.
Yeah. So sometimes these terms get a little confusing. I'm looking at your chats, and some of you put in our antecedents negative and positive as well. And that's all natural for this. Some of this terminology can be a little bit confusing when we say the word punishment. And we tend to, in the schools today, not do punishment. But in other words, if you think about punishment as discipline or consequences, those could mean different things in different contexts. What I would just say, and then you'll see in some of your modules when you do them, is that often these punishments, because this does work in a cyclic way, so your punishments or your reinforcers can become antecedents in their own way later on. So there's a cycle that happens because we're living in real time. So these are not things that are magical cures. Oh my God, I can figure out the antecedent, I can figure out the consequence. And like Pavlov's dog, just manipulate to get whatever you want. That doesn't work. We have to look a little deeper and understand that these things all influence each other. But in terms of punishment, this is very important because you need to understand the clinical terms of punishment. And what we're referring to is not punishment in the way that maybe like in Texas, where they still allow you to spank a kid if your parents opt in. That is a certain type of punishment. But let's avoid that term. What do we mean in our terminology? So there's a positive punishment that doesn't mean it's necessarily good, and a negative punishment doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. We're not using those terms. Positive means to gain, negative means to take away from a scientific point of view, if you would. Just want you to dwell on that for a second. When we say positive, we're not representing to Norman Vincent Peale and positive good feelings or whatever else. It's positive. We're adding something to the equation. Negative, like in mathematical terms, means you're taking something away. So positive punishment means something undesirable is given or is added after action is displayed. So, I mean, I said spanking, that is one thing that is often referred to as corporal punishment, which is outlawed in some states, not in other states. But positive punishment might be also detention. We're giving you something that is unpleasant for you. Negative punishment is the removal of something desirable that was previously expected. So, like at the school that I work at, they have lunch detention. Now, notice I just said detention is positive punishment, but lunch detention is negative punishment because we're taking away your privileges to go outside the building for lunch. We're removing something that is desirable and making you sit in the building for your lunchtime. So that's a negative punishment. We're taking away something. So you need to think about those things when you talk about punishment. Generally in research, punishment has short-term gains, but is not necessarily sustainable in the long term for modifying behavior. It has a very specific purpose, but in itself is probably not enough to deal with behaviors that might be a result of things that are just part of a child and who they are and their divergent learning and stuff like that. So we have to kind of balance that. Sound okay, Dr. Mack? You're on mute, so just letting you know. You're still on mute. You might want to take yourself off mute.
There we go.
Okay.
Yes, I was agreeing with what you were saying, Dr. T, and mentioning that I was a fifth grader before New York State outlawed spanking, and I experienced that. But some examples, more examples, some home examples. The student or the child at home doesn't clean his or her or their room. And the consequence is you will clean your room and you're also going to clean out that dusty cellar. This is a terrible job of washing the dishes. Go back and wash them again. Okay, this is positive punishment, adding more on. It could be the teacher giving additional homework, more of what some kids consider to be punishing. Plus, is there some negative punishment there in that the extra homework takes away the student's free time? But as for another example of negative punishment, taking away an earned point from the kid's total in the classroom. At home, taking away the promised trip to the water park because of the behavior that was displayed in the home. Taking away the use of the car if it's a teenager. Other examples, moving the clip down from green on the chart in front of the room to yellow to red. We are taking away status, negative punishment.
And there's a couple of points as you go into reinforcements that people made in the chat. Um, and I appreciate the comments that Joel made. Um, so that's a sort of replacement behavior. When positive punishment be something like encouraging a behavior that you would like to see repeated. And I would just say you just put the cart before the horse in terms of this class. We're going to get to what that is later on because that is definitely a type of intervention where we give certain as you we don't do punishments around that. We more or less do different types of reinforcement around the behaviors that we want to maybe replace if the target behavior is something that we want to decrease. But if the target behavior is something that you want to increase, you'll see um, more or less a lot more opportunities to do that in the reinforcements that Dr. Mack is going to talk about.
Yes, so many problems with punishment. Kids become immune to it. Say, you know what? I went through that. It wasn't all that bad. It creates resentment. It creates retaliation. It creates rebellion. So we try to go positive whenever possible. Some examples of positive reinforcement. I'm certain you know this, that you are big on using this with individuals that you run across, children, youth, and adults. But some examples of student engages in appropriate behavior. Think about, well, gosh, how do I respond to that positively? How will I when I'm in the classroom? Some examples: stickers, points, private or public verbal recognition, sending positive notes home. Gee, helping someone pick up the materials that they dropped. And I'll need to get rid of that last word, but gee, what we do that whenever we see somebody drop something. What motivates us? Well, probably a higher level reinforcement, internally feeling good, enjoying the smile and the thanks that you receive, feeling good that you've helped another individual, a higher level reinforcer. But as to why I continue to open doors for people in New York City when they don't respond, I'm still trying to figure that out. But important to know that just because we give something that we think is a positive reinforcer, it's not unless the person views it as a positive reinforcer. How do we know they view it that way? Because we see more of the behavior that we've just positively recognized. The ABA people draw a distinction between the words reward and reinforcement. Reward is something we give, but is it reinforcing? Okay? Not everybody finds the same things to be positive as we do. And negative reinforcement. Now, this is one of the more difficult terms to wrap our brains around, but is having a behavior reinforced. Pay attention to that second word, reinforcement. We know that whatever we're doing here, if it builds the behavior, it strengthens the behavior, we're more likely to see that behavior in the future. It's reinforcement. So what is this negative version of it? Okay. If you show an action to either avoid a bad situation, or if you're in a bad situation and you show a behavior and it allows you to escape it, that is negative reinforcement. What do you do when you're walking down the street and an ambulance goes by? Cover our ears, and the volume of that sound, the intensity of it is reduced. We escape that punishing situation. Think of the excuses you've used to escape a bad date. Oh, I've got an early date tomorrow, and I just have to leave at this point. Okay. I heard that many times during my single days. You take a swig of milk, you realize it is soured. What do? I won't demonstrate here, but chances are you spit it out. Spitting out the milk allowed you to escape that terrible taste. You notice a mosquito on your arm. For most people, that is a negative experience. How do they escape it? All right. So that action of slapping makes the terrible situation go away if you've got good aim. Why do we use sunscreen? If you do, to avoid the aging effects of the sun, to avoid sunburn. If it works, you avoid the sunburn, you have been negatively reinforced. You have escaped a negative situation. Yes, it feels good not to be punished. It feels reinforcing. So let's just handle a couple of quick ones here. A student completes the homework because she enjoys learning more about that subject matter. Now, here's a kid who's saying, I love studying about chemistry. And I love this homework because I know more about chemical properties and it'll help me when I apply for the chemistry program at the university. What kind of reinforcement is in play here? I'm gathering that you have thought that over, and you've decided that indeed it is positive reinforcement. I feel good. A benefit comes to me. Enjoyment, positive reinforcement. A student completes her homework in order to avoid being publicly scolded by the teacher the next day. All right, so completing the homework, doesn't want to do it, but at least the teacher isn't going to call me out in front of the rest of the class and chastise me. You're thinking it over, whether you enter it in the chat or not. You're thinking, that seems to me to be negative reinforcement, engaging in a behavior to prevent this awful thing from ever happening. But then we can look at the teacher side of this too, that the teacher has been scolding kids. And you know what? It gets the homework done. For the teacher, scolding kids is positively reinforced. There is less of the student, there is more of the completion of the homework. Of course, this is punishing to the students, and so we're going to run across resentment, retaliation, rebellion, etc. The teacher allows students to use their phones. It has to be on, they have to silence it if they've completed the in-class assignment and come up to the desk. We give it a quick look and say, okay, this passes muster. You may go to the phone. I'm guessing that you also believe that it is positive reinforcement from the student's perspective. By completing it accurately and quickly, I now get to enjoy some time on the phone. Now, for the teacher, it also seems to be positively reinforcing. I let the kids use their phones if they give me a quality product. I'm getting more quality products. That's reinforcing to me. A benefit has come to me. There are some others, but let's see. How about the student answers a simpler starter question early in the session? That way, he won't have to answer some of the more advanced questions that come later in the lesson. I'm Student is showing a behavior now, giving an answer to a question early in class, and then gets to bypass needing to respond later on. The teacher will call on other kids. The student's behavior avoids that um, non-desired outcome later in the class. All right. Now, there's a lot that happens before a behavior is shown, but the most recent thing to happen just before the behavior, we call the antecedent. There's other stimuli that happen throughout the day, throughout the class, but then something sets off the behavior. That something that is closest to the behavior is known as the antecedent. Does anyone know, if you'd enter into the chat, what about those things that happened before the antecedent? What are they called? Let's imagine that, yes, a student refuses, the teacher gives a direction, please start your assignment. And the student says, I ain't doing it. I'm not in the mood. Okay, so we got the antecedent, but it's important to investigate what came before the antecedent. Gee, there was some tension in the home. In fact, there's also some food insecurity in the home. Walking to school on a day where the rain has just ended, a car goes by and splashes up muddy water from a puddle near the curb, and it gets on the student's clothes. And other kids make fun of what just happened. Gosh, there's a lot of agitation, a lot of things happening before that final direction by the teacher, and no, I'm not in the mood to do it. What are those stimuli called that come before the antecedent? Did we get that in the chat, Dr.
Yes,
T?
we did, but just keep in mindful that we're at 45 minutes now. We have environmental factors is what people are putting. Um,
All right. And perhaps there was setting
Precedent,
events
yeah.
in there. And we
Yep.
will, yes, so the setting events are the stimuli that come before the antecedent that really add to it. All right. And you will be, for part one, conducting an excuse me, yes, in one of the parts, you'll be conducting an ABC analysis. And yes, ABC it is, as simple as 1, 2, 3. You see the behavior that you've defined. And then you think about, well, what came before it? And what was the trigger, the antecedent? And then we say, oh, what happened after that behavior? Because that's what's keeping that behavior going in those circumstances. And you'll be identifying a behavior. And in one of the situations where it happens, you'll report what came before it, what came after it, an ABC analysis. And that's part of a procedure for figuring out whether a kid has a disability in the area of a behavior. So I want you to summon up the ghosts of SPED 700.5. What does FBA stand for? That process for determining whether a student has a disability in the area of behavior? Hopefully all of you are seeing in your mind functional behavior assessment. We're trying to figure out the function, the drive, the purpose, the reason for that behavior. And if a kid has any primary disability, if they also have, according to this functional behavior assessment, a behavioral disability, then that is also addressed in the student's IEP document. It's required by the U.S. Department of Education. It was that back when it was approved back in the 70s, And the U.S. Department of Education said, when we're concerned about a student's behavior, we must engage in a functional behavior assessment. It was poorly defined until a colleague of mine, Gary Sasso, wrote an article and said that it should be all based on applied behavior analysis. Schools that didn't know what to do grabbed onto that, and it has become the pro forma, the way to conduct an FBA. You'll be engaging in certain parts of it. Gosh, in part one, you'll be identifying the behavior in observable, measurable, and precise terms. And for part two, you'll be collecting numerical data, quantitative data regarding that behavior, how it exists at present, where you have to skip a few parts because you're not a member of a team conducting the FBA, but you will conduct an ABC analysis and try to identify how the antecedent and the consequence influence the behavior. And indeed, if the student has a disability in the area of behavior, then in that IEP, after our functional behavior assessment has determined a disability in the area of behavior, we've got to write up a BIP. Hopefully that also comes back to mind from SPED 700.5. BIP standing for a behavior intervention plan. Behavior intervention plan in which the IEP team looks at the data that's been collected, the functional behavior assessment results, and then defines in precise and observable terms, okay, measurable terms, what the replacement behavior is. What are we going to put in place of that behavior that is of concern to us? What is the preferred behavior we'd like to see under that set of circumstances? Knowing that the behavior we want to replace, the behavior we want to put in as a replacement has to meet the same function. If we say, let's build a new behavior in place of the one that concerns us, but it doesn't match the student's need for attention or sensory stimulation or whatever the function is of that kid's present behavior, then the kid's going to say, why would I change out the old behavior for the new? It's not giving me what it is that motivates me to show my present behavior. I need that same function met and at least to the same degree, or else I'm not changing my behavior. So we're switching gears now, going to our part one paper. Yes, you'll be submitting it by the 2nd of March, but what all is included here? Well, first of all, yes, you'll be submitting it on that date and assuming it passes with flying colors because you've engaged actively into the learning modules and you've checked in with your course instructor. And perhaps you're saying, I wouldn't mind bouncing this off of my professor before the submission date, and you can submit it for a quick feedback on how it's going thus far. You can submit it to our Brightspace site and get feedback from your professor. All right. And then for part two, after you've pass muster with part one, then you're going to engage in collecting data on the behavior that you identified in part one. You're going to make sense of it. You're going to put it into some organized form, a table or a graph. And then you're going to talk about you're going to write about how you would implement certain interventions. Those interventions are in our learning modules, the category of our learning modules for part two of the paper. You'll be looking through those learning modules, learning about certain behaviors, and then writing about how you would implement those interventions for your focus learner. Now, part 3 of the CAB-MR is completely unrelated to the first 2 parts. You'll be evaluating the performance of a teacher on the material and the checklists in the learning modules for part 3 of the paper. You might decide to evaluate your own performance if you're out there in the classroom right now. So, why are we doing this? It sounds very complicated, and indeed it is effort intensive, no doubt about it, this CAB-MR paper. Well, it will behoove you because you're going to be taking the Students with Disabilities state exam. And there's a lot of information on applied behavior analysis, data recording, classroom management. And you're going to become proficient and skilled in contributing to the pre-referral process when we are concerned about our students' behavior or academic performance. There are certain procedures we go through before we then engage in referring the student for consideration as to whether there might be a disability in this case. And you'll be able to contribute to the pre-referral process, the referral process, where we're trying to determine if the student does have special needs and we need to create an IEP. You'll be able to contribute to the functional behavior assessment and the development of the behavior intervention plan, and whether that intervention plan is working. It will allow you, this course in parts 1 and 2, to offer information to the home so we can work as a team with them. And in fact, in part 2, you'll be making recommendations to that focus learners, home-based adults. And we can share data information and a graph and show how the line's moving to inform the student of the progress in changing the behavior and hopefully motivate that student to engage in more. You will see this on our website and in the description of the CAB-MR, but there are 4 subheadings in it. You'll be telling us about the student's neighborhood. Tell us about your school. Tell us a bit about the student's family unit. Then tell us a lot about the student, keeping the identity secretive, anonymous, make up a false name. I should not be able to identify who this student is if I happen to really know this kid. And some of the information that you'll provide there. In the target behavior, typically it's 1 sentence, maybe 2, as you define the behavior. A lot of folks want to give examples. They want to elaborate. The definition is just precise, observable, measurable actions that you witness when the student shows the behavior 1 time, a singular event. Explanations, elaboration, what we sometimes call the fluff, put that in the focus learner part. Your target behavior, you're going to state it in the present tense because you're going to notice, oh, it's happening now, the present tense. So when you define your behavior, you are going to define what is seen, what is heard, what is witnessed when the student shows the behavior 1 time. You'll be counting how many 1 times it is. And in the present tense, and we're going to ask you to focus on what the student is doing. If some of the definitions that sometimes come in are student is not working. Okay. Well, what is the student doing? Oh, student is reading a comic book. Student is looking out the window. Define a behavior that is happening, and it has to be precise, saying, the definition is student out of seat. No, that's what we call it. But what do you witness when the student is out of the seat? Oh, body no longer in contact with horizontal plane of chair. Okay, that is the action, what we witness. And tell us which of the 6 dimensions of behavior is of concern. Do we want to change the duration of it? Would we like to change the topography? These are parts of part 1. And we also want to know, what data recording procedure are you going to use? Are you going to use frequency recording? You're going to make a tally mark every time the student shows this short-lived behavior? Are you going to put the stopwatch on it because sometimes that behavior lasts quite a while? Or maybe you'll use some of the other procedures that you'll read about in the learning modules. And this we will cover more in depth next week.
Okay,
Everything
can I
we've
take, can I just take
do.
it, please? Right, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Mack. What I'm going to take it over now because that was a lot of information that was given to you. I put you into small groups, and what I would like you to do in your small groups is go into Brightspace and look specifically at the criteria for part 1. I also ask that if you have time in your groups to look at the exemplars of part 1 and what that means. Today's sessions is really focusing on understanding what are the deliverables that you need to present for part 1, and also problem solving with your peers, because there are examples, if you're not in a classroom, what you can do for another student and so forth that are in those criteria that's on Brightspace, and there's also exemplars. But this is a great opportunity for you to look at those and then kind of problem solve and identify maybe questions or concerns that are coming out of that after you look at the examples and the criteria, and then bring them back to us as a group. Okay. Don't worry about part 2 at this point. Don't worry about part 3 because there's different sessions for those. There's a lot of information, a lot of context given to you today. Really, it's just